This lecture on buying into the Cold War attempts to draw some really important connections between American foreign policy and how Americans experienced life on an everyday basis, kind of their social and family history of Americans. And I want you to keep this particular image in mind as I start moving through the slides, because this is ultimately revealing the stakes and the context for everything that follows. And this, of course, is an explosion of a test nuclear bomb. Okay, so containment. Eisenhower, who you remember from World War II, and Richard Nixon, who was at the time his vice president, were advocates of a foreign policy called containment. At the core of this policy was the idea that the U.S. needed to have tech and nuclear capacity that could deter Soviets from ever interfering with American interests. And mostly this was about creating kind of a fear that there would be massive retaliation if anything did happen. So doing things like, on the previous slide, running tests in a very public fashion was arguably part of the strategy. This strategy both made Americans feel more secure and completely and totally terrified. So here with the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, there were massive exhibits all over the place encouraging people to prepare for the possibility of a nuclear attack. So here in a fair-like setting, you can go inside the tent and see what kind of fallout shelter you should build for you and your family, preferably in the basement or an adjacent area of your home. People really did this. Okay, so we have up in the left, this is an example from Pleasanton, and you can see the model of what such a fallout shelter was supposed to look like. Right? I suppose you could dig yourself a pool, but instead dig a fallout shelter with all sorts of canned supplies and radios so you understand when it's okay to return to the surface again. And again, people actually did this. Inside the school system, there was a lot of constant ongoing conversation about how to handle the possibility of a nuclear explosion in the area. So the sign on the left was actually meant for the classroom. And usually carried a whole bunch of, it was actually part of a sequence of like 6 similar posters that were all trying to explain how this would work. On the right, you see an example of a sample drill, which if you talk to anybody from the 1950s who lived on either coast of the United States, they recall with some chagrin being told that hiding under their desks would somehow protect them from a nuclear bomb, which was unlikely. Okay, so at this point, just because this seems so crazy that there's no way you're going to believe me if you don't see additional evidence, can you please go to the Pages section of our course webpage? And there's a video called Duck and Cover that's from 1950. That was a film strip that was actually shown to children. And I want you to go ahead and take a look at that and then head over to discussion and answer the question that I posed there about the film. So I'm pausing now. So this all kind of, what you can start to sense is the way in which personal family decisions took on a certain kind of valiance in this Cold War context that was really different. Here we have a picture of Vice President Nixon and the Soviet First Secretary Khrushchev coming together for the kitchen debate, which you should recall is one of the readings that's assigned for this particular class. Okay. This photo was taken at the opening of the American National Exhibition, which was on display in Moscow in 1959. As part of the display, the Americans actually built a full suburban home, like a model home in the middle of the area, and asked people to come through and see what the exhibit really implied was a home that anyone would be able to afford in the United States. It was really designed to showcase the kind of consumer comforts that were available as a result of capitalism. Okay, so we'll talk more about the kitchen debate over Zoom this week, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview. Also to see, to a certain extent, how the American public perceived what happened. The debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, which was spontaneous, not planned, wound up being something that got a lot of publicity on either side. And the debate itself is weird. When you read it, it reads really strange as text, and especially when you remember everything that's said goes through an interpreter first. So I think it's worth kind of looking at and taking a close look at. So in the 1950s, Americans clearly defined themselves and their nation less upon what they produced and more upon what they consumed. Suburbanization, which we talked about earlier, fueled extensive spending, and as people moved from apartments to houses, their needs for furniture and appliances increased, and middle-class families sought out maybe 2 cars instead of 1. By 1960, 75% of Americans had at least 1 car, and new industries arose to meet the needs of driving Americans. New things like fast food, motels, kind of locations to go to, like drive-in theaters or amusement parks, all started to really explode. Cigarette advertising increased 400% between 1945 and 1960, whereas advertising in general increased 250%. Credit cards emerged for the first time. The Diners Club credit card appeared in 1950, soon followed by American Express. Americans were about to do on a much larger scale what they had previously done in the 1920s and make more and more of their purchases on credit. Now, the 1950s were also the dawn of rock and roll. The genre had its roots in African American R&B, which most white-owned radio stations refused to play. White singers such as Pat Boone would cover songs by African Americans. But by mid-decade, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Ray Charles had all started to cross over. Elvis Presley emerged with Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, and Dick Clark's American Bandstand premiered at the end of the decade. Right now, what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and go over to the Pages section, and there is an episode of American Bandstand up there. Please watch however much strikes you as interesting, because it is interesting. Okay, go ahead and pause the video now. Rock and roll and its accessories. Movies like Elvis's Jailhouse Rock from 1957, t-shirts and blue jeans. These became ambassadors abroad for how Americans understood the relationship between political and personal freedoms. At the same time, what was happening in American art again went to this idea of the tension, but also the mutually kind of constitutive nature of personal freedoms and national freedoms. So here you have Campbell's Soup Cans by Andy Warhol, which is, of course, expressing kind of the pop art moment, right? And here you have a consumer item that, replicated to the point way beyond eccentricity, right, is meant to take a familiar object out of its context, right? And in so doing that, it's making a pitch kind of for and playing with the idea of consumerism while at the same time critiquing it. Here we have abstract expressionism with Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm from 1950. Increasingly, the use of unorthodox or strange kind of forms of visual art became one of the ways that Americans could gain a lot of support, strangely, from government funding sources, simply because they illustrated the existence of a kind of freedom and liberation in the United States. And so works that earlier might have been cast off as, dubiously non-conforming, all of a sudden got a certain kind of support and cachet because they demonstrated freedoms that were ostensibly held widely. But at the same time, of course, not everybody was. So one of the things that we're just on the horizon of getting to is the kind of reinvigorating African-American civil rights movement that's really going to start to develop in the mid-50s, and by the mid-60s be a phenomenal political force. Part of what we have to get is this idea that if Americans are consuming and exporting consumer goods in a way that's meant to further foreign policy, right, of the Cold War, to say that the American democratic capitalist system is good because it provides easily for its people, then really quickly, if personal decisions about what you wear or what you listen to become a form of politics, so too does any critique of the existing system become seen as a form of communism. Okay? That starts to help you make a little more sense of what otherwise is a very confusing combination of things on these sides, which is that race mixing is communist, which is, of course, what this anti-integration crowd is claiming in 1959 outside the Arkansas Capitol building in response to the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. The idea here was that civil rights advocates trying to integrate the schools were gaining publicity internationally. And when they gained that international publicity, it made the United States look bad to other countries. And that the only reason why you would want to make the United States look bad was if you were a communist. Okay. So went the thinking. So with this kind of perspective, right, the entire civil rights movement could be attacked as something that was merely a conspiracy to make America look worse than it was, and hence something that could be dismissed as communist and should be stifled and suppressed. So this is the context in which you're going to have the African American civil rights movement trying to get a toehold, and think about how exactly they're going to go about trying to maneuver around these particular claims. Okay, so go ahead, make sure that you hit all of those web pages that I directed you to. I want to make sure that you watch some of the kind of classic clips from the 1950s and get a sense of what it's like, and keep thinking about the relationship between consumer goods, that decisions people make every day at the store, and the larger political world in which those operate.